Welcome to Difficult Dialogues, Voices from the Valley. I'm Lynn Pasquerella, president of Mount Holyoke College. Difficult Dialogues is intended to bring to bear voices from the Valley on some of the most complex social, ethical, and legal issues of the day. Today, I'm joined by Robin Claremont and Doug Hall from the National Priorities Project. First, let's begin, Robin, with a description of what you do. What is the National Priorities Project, and what are your objectives?
Sure. Thank you so much for having us on the show today. National Priorities Project is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We're based in Northampton, but we work nationally, and our mission is to track the federal budget so that ordinary Americans, folks like you and me, can understand how the government is using our tax dollars and how that money flows into our communities. So one of the primary things that we do is we localize the budget so people can see how the money trickles down essentially from the federal level to the state level as well as to the county and the city level. And the reason why we do this is because we believe that the federal budget is an essential part of our democracy and something that all Americans should have a say in. It should reflect our values as a nation, and because it's our tax dollars, we should be able to have a voice in how the government uses that money.
Transparency certainly does seem key as part of our nation's historic mission.
Absolutely.
So, Doug, tell us about the budget. Most people don't understand the broad budget issues with respect to budgets at the national level. So how do resources get allocated? Is there a difference between discretionary and non-discretionary spending? Who gets to decide? How are those processes unfolding in our budgets today?
Yeah, those are all very good questions. And I think you're right that a lot of people don't really understand what the federal budget is all about. I think there's a sense amongst many folks that that's something that happens in DC and sort of that political bubble. And it's also a political bubble that I think people are increasingly disdainful of. And so I think there's a reluctance to weigh in and to really wrap their heads around what's going on there. But as Robin notes, the federal budget is inextricably intertwined with our state budgets, with our local budgets. Pretty much every facet of our civic lives, whether it's, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the fact that we have a judicial system and all those sorts of things, an education system, all of that interplays with the federal budget. We're talking about a budget that is about $3.9 trillion in federal fiscal year 15, which is where we are right now. Big chunks of that, as you've suggested, go to non-discretionary programs, which are things like Social Security and Medicare. Those are actually the two biggest pieces of the budget pie. And then, of course, the military is another significant chunk. We spent, in federal fiscal year 15, we will be spending about $640 billion on the military, and that's an awful lot of money. It's also more money than we spend on all of the other things, things like education and environment. All those sort of smaller pieces of the budget pie are, completely dwarfed by the amount of money that we spend on defense.
And so military spending is considered non-discretionary?
It's part of the discretionary budget. Okay. And so we actually, the discretionary budget is the portion of the budget that Congress and the President, the executive branch, work together to determine what is allocated there. And it's Congress's legal responsibility, but of course, the executive branch can sort of make recommendations. We need this amount for education, we need this amount for Department of Defense, et cetera. And then, of course, it goes into this sort of political mishmash. And we're, very much in the midst of that right now. We've had the president's budget rolled out a few weeks ago, and now we have Congress, and at this point that's dominated in both the House and the Senate by the Republican Party. They are in the process of crafting their alternative budgets. And then you've got folks like the Progressive Caucus that will have their own recommendations on the budget that we should pursue. And at the end of the day, there needs to be an agreement that's reached by Congress, and what will come out of that, of course, is a budget that will shape the direction of our nation over the next year.
Robin, talk a bit about how those kinds of partisan debates impact the allocation with respect to any particular budget.
Sure. Well, as we've seen very frequently in the last several years, the budget process can be quite delayed and not follow its ordinary path due to political gridlock. And what happens is the House and the Senate are both expected to put forth budget proposals and reconcile them into something that Congress and the President can agree on. And when you have very different perspectives about how the government should be spending money and how much the government should be spending, which is our current political situation, that can create a situation where there's no agreement. And in the past several years, that has happened many times where Congress cannot agree on a budget in time for the next federal fiscal year, so they pass what's called a continuing resolution, which is essentially just continuing the previous year's budget without any sort of debate or discussion about what our current funding needs are. So that definitely political gridlock reduces the participation that citizens are able to have in the budget process, and it also is damaging to our democracy because it's not necessarily responding to the needs for investment that we have as a nation.
One of the things that's really interesting about the situation we're currently in, I think people expect there to be conflict between Democrats and Republicans, but in the budget process we're in the midst of right now, there's every potential for the Republicans themselves to have very divergent views on where we should be going. And the crux of the matter there is you've got your budget hawks, folks that want to spend significantly more money on defense on one side, but then you have the deficit hawks, the folks that are very concerned about keeping expenditures down, folks who would like to see us shrink government sort of across all fronts. On the other side. And so those two folks are sets of folks are going to have to, have their own reconciliation. There won't be a formal reconciliation, but they're going to need to have a sufficient meeting of the minds, or, somebody needs to come out on top in what will undoubtedly be a pretty significant power struggle within the Republican Party.
Mm. All budgets, including household budgets, reflect a certain set of values and priorities. What does the national budget reflect in terms of values?
Well, we believe that it should reflect, as I mentioned earlier, the values of the citizens overall. Unfortunately, our budget isn't always a true reflection of what Americans say they want, and what Americans, in terms of polling or general public opinion, say is important for our nation to be investing in. For example, the majority of Americans think we should invest in education, that the federal government should support education initiatives and food assistance initiatives and health care, Social Security. All of those types of social and human needs programs are very important to Americans overall. Unfortunately, in the budget, as Doug was mentioning earlier, we see consistently year over year for the past many decades that those programs actually only receive a very small portion of the entire federal budget. And consistently, the military receives a disproportionate amount of federal funding in comparison to those programs that are very important to Americans.
Doug, President Obama has been aggressive in saying we need more high school graduates to go into college. We need to train a workforce, especially in STEM. He's proposed free community college programming. What impact does that have on the budget, and what are the impediments toward achieving the goals that he's outlined?
Well, I think as we've suggested, the most significant impediment will be a political one, where you'll have opposition on the other side to his proposal, not just because it costs money, but simply because we see across so many fronts, pretty much whatever the president proposes is going to be opposed by the other side. And that's obviously a dysfunction of our current political situation that we need to find a way to address, because what we really want to see is folks on both sides of the aisle working together to find some programs that there's a meeting of the minds on. And certainly, the rhetoric would suggest that, we recognize that we are in a, competitive global economy, the children are our future, all those things. And yet, as Robin's noted, education, the amount of money that the federal government spends on education is in the range of 2% of the overall budget. 2%, that's, it's a crumb compared to what we're spending, for example, on defense. And I think the disconnect, as Robin has said, between our values as expressed through any number of dimensions and the ways that we have actually allocated our budget, that disconnect is huge, and it's certainly one of the things that we need to address. Having said that, the President's proposal to offer free college, I think is a great one, and it's certainly one that, yes, it will cost money, but it's an investment in our nation, it's an investment in a generation, and I think it's also an investment in a generation at a time when young people are facing two huge issues right now. First off is that coming out of this recession, the youth unemployment rate has been, significantly higher than everybody else, and the scarring effects of that will last throughout their careers, unfortunately. At the same time, as you know, I'm sure all too well, we have this generation of students who are burdened with this huge student debt. I think I heard the other day it was somewhere in the range of maybe $2 trillion. I mean, it's an enormous sum, and it's just alarming to know that we have, an entire generation that's going to be saddled with this. And what's really a shame about that is it hurts those people as individuals. It hurts their ability to engage fully in the economy. And as a result, it's not just, the kids that go to college that are being burdened, but we're all paying a price in an economy that is less vibrant, in a housing sector that is not rebounding from the recession the way it should, because the young people that would normally be, saving their money to buy a house, they can't save their money because they're spending their money to pay down their student debts. And so the ripple effects of that are huge. And the fact that the federal government is in the mix in this and, has been, literally making money off of student debt loads is unconscionable. And it's something that I think the President is recognizing we need to be finding different ways to address, and certainly, free college tuition, 2-year college tuition is a great first step in that direction.
One thing I wanted to add to that great point is just looking at the numbers, just to put things in perspective a little bit. The free community college proposal is $60 billion over 10 years. So it would invest over 10 years a total of $60 billion to support that proposal. And just again, to put it in perspective, in 1 year, we've spent, over the past decade, each year we've spent $139 billion in 1 year just on war. So you're thinking about that in perspective to an investment of $60 billion over 10 years is pretty significant. How might those dollars be used to really invest in our young people or invest in our education system as opposed to fighting war abroad? And in terms of another comparison, corporate offshore tax loopholes. We haven't really talked that much about the revenue side of the budget, but tax loopholes and money lost to the government through tax breaks is also another big piece of the federal budget. And just one corporate tax loophole that allows corporations to defer profits earned abroad costs $65 billion in 1 year. So again, compare that to $60 billion over 10 years for the free community college proposal, and it's quite sobering.
Robin, you also outlined a number of concerns that the public have with respect to healthcare, environmental concerns, opportunities for youth. Let's turn to healthcare. Doug, we have an aging population in the United States. Healthcare costs at the end of life are skyrocketing. Obama's plan, Obamacare, is back in the courts. Mm-hmm. What do you see as the direction of healthcare concerns with respect to the budget?
Well, certainly, as I've previously mentioned, the Medicare and health piece of the budget pie, that's the biggest piece. That's, almost $1 trillion just for those things. And so finding ways to contain those costs, the so-called notion of bending the cost curve on healthcare is definitely something we need to see. We've actually had some reassuring numbers just this past week about the cost, some of the costs associated with Obamacare that are coming in at something like 20% less than had originally been projected across certain fronts. And that's reassuring. It certainly suggests that some of the efficiencies that we've been looking for in that will in fact be realized. At the same time, as you note, we have this court case going on that could really throw a monkey wrench in the works. And I think it remains to be seen how that will play out and what the fallout will be. Certainly Obamacare it's a complicated system, and it's a system that interacts in different ways with different states. And so that's certainly the source of some of the complexity and some of the challenges. At the same time, I think one of the real important takeaways with healthcare costs is that we spend more, far more as a nation on healthcare than any other nation, by an order of magnitude difference. And at the same time, we have poorer results in terms of mortality and morbidity. And so it's clear that we're spending money that's not really that productive in terms of our health outcomes. And there's lots of different explanations for that. I was reading something yesterday actually around the varying costs of a basic blood test, which, if I remember the numbers right, range from something like $15 to $10,000 for the exact same test. And I think it's entirely reasonable to assume that anyone who's charging $10,000 for that is making an exorbitant profit off of that is coming out of your pocket and mine, and is literally in the process of potentially crippling our budget, but also at the same time crippling our economy and placing undue burdens on folks. That's sort of the glass half empty perspective. The glass half full perspective is that, because we recognize that there are those sorts of efficiencies, if we can find a way to address that and pare back, the growth in healthcare costs, the potential upside of that, as a nation, I think will be huge.
There was some interesting rhetoric around the recent measles outbreak that this was the fault of immigrants, when in fact the immigrants who are coming to the United States are much more likely to be vaccinated than many children in the United States. How much are we spending on patrolling the borders and looking at undocumented residents in the U.S.?
I don't think we have those numbers at our fingertips, but I think it's fair to say that certainly there are significant costs associated with keeping our borders safe. The discussions around immigration and the sorts of rhetoric that comes out of those discussions is not to me, that's not so much a budget issue. It's sort of a much more broad-based public policy issue that we certainly need to wrap our heads around. Yes, there are budget implications. The most recent, venue for these discussions, of course, was around the Republicans holding Department of Homeland Security funding hostage, because of the Obama administration's position on immigration and allowing folks, a significant number of illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, to remain in the country, with certain various conditions. And that's really a good example of the type of dysfunction and sort of political gamesmanship that Robin mentioned earlier that, is really messes up the entire system. And it's a great example where we've allowed politics to intrude on what should be a much more forthright and productive budget process for us.
Robin, there was an anniversary recently of Frances Perkins' appointment as the first woman cabinet member, one of the architects of Social Security. Does Social Security have a future?
Yes, actually. The numbers show that Social Security is quite viable for many years into the future. Even on the same with the same budget conditions that we currently have. if some small changes were made to the program, to create some savings, it could be viable decades into the future. I think it's, what is it, out to 2026 or 20, do you have?
I know it was 2037 for a while, and I think it's a little bit sooner when there's sort of an inflection point where beyond which, without some fixes, the coverage would be reduced from where it is right now. My sense is that there's a lot of alarmism around the situation with Social Security. Just the fact that we would be, questioning whether it has a future. Of course, it has a future. Not only does it have a future, it's the most reliable piece of our retirement security stool. You talk about sort of the three components of retirement security being Social Security, some sort of pension, employer-based retirement, and then personal savings. Well, with the middle class under attack across so many fronts, we've sawed off the leg of that stool that should be around personal savings. Employers have been shifting from they've been shifting their funding into things like 401ks that will provide a much less reliable retirement for folks. So they've been sawing off that leg of the stool. And at the same time, we have people who are threatening to cut off another leg of the stool around Social Security. What we need to do instead is to find ways to make Social Security stronger, to invest more significantly there, to compensate for the fact that folks' retirement security is being undermined across those other fronts.
And as I said, there are some simple changes that would create significant savings for the program. And while there have been proposals to change the program, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of, there's overwhelming public support for the Social Security program from, across generations. Young people as well as older people want Social Security to be viable years into the future. So certainly any proposed changes that would diminish the program or the benefits allocated to the program would be met by, I think, public disagreement with that direction, and so hopefully we won't ever get to that point.
One of the easiest fixes for Social Security right now, the portion of an individual's income that is subject to a Social Security tax taps out. I want to say it's around $116,000. So for folks who are making more money than that, the money they're making beyond that point is not going into Social Security. And so certainly, while there may be some potential cost savings to be had, I think most of the real solutions around Social Security need to be more on the revenue side, finding ways to increase the money that goes into that system, and certainly asking wealthy folks who are making a lot more to pay something that's more consistent with the rates that other folks are paying. Is a very significant piece of the puzzle. It doesn't completely solve the problem, but it goes a very long way towards getting us much closer to having a sound system into the future.
Those of us in Western Massachusetts were counting the minutes to spring's arrival. We had a particularly challenging winter, and across much of the nation there were weather anomalies. There's concern over climate change, global warming. What are we doing in the United States to put our money into alternative sources of energy, really looking at the impact of what humans are doing and interacting with nature?
I think the short answer to that is that we're not doing anywhere near enough. It seems that across, political ideologies, except perhaps with folks, in the Green Party, there seems to be a reluctance to really face the dire situation that we're facing and to implement policies and budget strategies that really help to put us on a sounder front. Certainly we've seen some sort of isolated examples that I think are reasonable to attribute to climate change in terms of, the types of disasters that we're looking at. But I think as we look into the coming decades, just something really as basic as having enough water. There's significant parts of this nation that are currently, facing prolonged drought situations, and it's going to get much worse before it gets better. And the truth is, it's not going to get better if we don't do something fairly significant to really address climate change in a meaningful way. One of the things that I would love to see would be to shift some of that $640 billion that we're spending on the military into addressing climate change. In fact, there's every possibility that the Pentagon might be a piece of that puzzle, because they have quite explicitly acknowledged that climate change is indeed a dire threat to our national security. And so, trying to figure out a way to have some of those very well-heeled military contractors, spending some of their resources and investing in technologies that actually help to solve climate change, that would be a positive step that would place us in a much sounder footing, both in terms of our budget, but also in terms of our long-term, viability as a nation and as a planet, frankly.
So in the last few minutes, Robin, tell us what it meant to the organization, to you, to be nominated for a Nobel Prize.
Oh, it was just an incredible honor and very humbling, certainly for all of us. We were nominated last year in 2014 by the International Peace Bureau, and it was in recognition of our work over the past 30 years. National Priorities Project was founded a little over 30 years ago, and for all of those years, we've been working on tracking the federal budget, as we've been discussing, but also specifically looking at spending on defense and military and the Pentagon and how it relates to domestic initiatives like we've been talking about today. And so our nomination was in recognition of that work, and also in recognition of the fact that the United States spends more on military and defense than the next 10 countries combined. So we certainly outspend most of or all of the world in terms of those expenses. And our work to draw attention to that and to shift spending priorities to other priorities was recognized by the Nobel Peace Prize nomination, and it certainly was a huge honor. We were all got up early on the day that they announced the Nobel Peace Prize. We didn't expect to win it, but we were very excited to be part of the group of nominees and incredibly honored by that.
Well, congratulations to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great to be here.